Alright guys, welcome back to the channel. It's Matty here and it's Tuesday, which means we have a new tier list. I'm really excited this week because this is our first official tier list of the new Space-Time Smackdown format. So yesterday on Meta Monday, we went through and did our official meta report of this first week of competition. So following that, we're going to go ahead and we're going to rank all of these decks on our respective tier list here. So basically, we're going to rank most of the decks. We have basically every deck that you could ever think of here on the tier list. However, a lot of these decks didn't see really any play in this first week of competition. A lot of people were playing newer cards and newer decks. So a lot of the cards or decks on here that maybe didn't really see any play in this first week, we're just not going to rank them yet. So that's why I have this can't rank yet tier. And then here, we're just going to go ahead and we're going to start ranking the ones that did see play this week. So first and foremost, let's take a look at Magnezone and Skarmory. So Magnezone and Skarmory is a really interesting list here. Skarmory didn't see as much play in this first week of competition that I really thought it would. However, Magnezone saw a tremendous lot of play in a lot of different decks, a lot of archetypes. We're ranging from Skarmory, Darkrai, even fighting package decks that were playing Magnezone. One of the great things about Magnezone is that it's very self-sufficient. You don't have to really build around it. You can just throw these 6 cards really in any deck and you're all of a sudden hitting for weakness against water-type Pokemon with very strong attacks on a very consistent attacker. It's got 140 HP Magnezone does, which means that, of course, with Giant Cape, we go up to 160, and that's a very good amount of HP. But like I said, a lot of water decks floating around here. Palkia EX, Articuno is pretty popular, Starmie as well. All cards that are seeing a tremendous amount of play right now. Gyarados as well. However, hitting for weakness on Gyarados doesn't really matter because we have 100 in HP, so it's not as big of a deal. It's not necessarily a counter card to Gyarados, but other water decks it's very good in. Skarmory as well, one of the best cards to come out of this new expansion. I was really hoping that it would become one of the best aggro archetypes in the game right now, and I do think that it is. Unfortunately, it didn't see as much play this week. However, this Magnezone and Skarmory deck did place very well in one of the recent online tournaments. It made top cut. There were 2 big tournaments this weekend. There was a 1,000-player Hooglandia and Spraggles tournament, and then of course there was the 1,800-player Ursa Days tournament, and this got top cut in one of those events, so I really like it. I'm going to put it in the A tier now. It didn't see enough play, or I guess it didn't get like first place or anything crazy for me to want to put it in S tier, but I do think that Magnezone is a very good Pokemon to play in this format right now, and I think that Skarmory is very underrated. The fast-paced aggression of Skarmory is top tier, one of the best aggro cards in the entire game. The other upside to this deck, though, is that it's very consistent. We're only playing a small amount of Pokemon, so basically we can lead off with Skarmory that much more, I guess, commonly, or that much more, consistently, which is really, really good. So I expect Skarmory decks to see a little bit more play as time goes on. It's just a good card. Magnezone will probably continue to see a ton of play in this format. Whether this is the most common way to play Skarmory, or as we see down here, if we go down, there is another Skarmory deck in here, which is going to be Skarmory and Bastiodon. Whether this card or this version of Skarmory sees more play, we'll have to see. But either way, I think Skarmory decks are very good. And speaking of Skarmory and Bastiodon, very similar to this Magnezone deck. However, it's less of an anti-meta pick here, where we're not playing Magnezone, we're playing straight Steel, and we're playing Bastiodon, which is arguably not as good of a Pokemon as Magnezone. Magnezone. But the cool thing about Bastiodon is that it's a fossil Pokemon. So in a deck like this, basically Skarmory is the only actual basic Pokemon in our deck, which means no matter what, we're always starting with Skarmory in the active spot. We're playing 4 or 5 tool cards in the deck, so very consistently, almost basically all of the time, every game, we're able to lead off with Skarmory and attack for 50 damage, and then, set up that Bastiodon a little bit later in the game, which can be really, really annoying. 180 HP on this thing with Giant Cape, plus the effect to minus the damage we take by 100. Still extremely, extremely strong. Skarmory is just really good because, again, it's fast-paced. 50 damage on your first turn is incredible. However, like we said, it's a single prize Pokemon, so you can go into Skarmory back-to-back and basically force your opponent to KO Skarmory 2 different times with Rocky Helmet. With the 50 damage can be a lot of damage for you to then go into Bastiodon at the end of the game and just clean up. The only downside to this Skarmory deck, I will still put it in the A tier in my opinion, maybe in the B tier. It didn't do very well in one tournament, and the other tournament got like top 8. I think we're probably going to put it in the... I'm going to put both of them in the A tier. They're probably going to end up low A tier. I kind of want to put Bastiodon more so in the high B tier. In fact, that's what I'll do, because the thing with Bastiodon is because you run fossils, sometimes you just don't draw into the fossils, and then you just end up playing only Skarmory, and you're not really going to win many games if you're only playing Skarmory. So I guess that's kind of a potential downside to this particular Bastiodon and Skarmory deck. And overall, I guess I would say that Magnezone is a little bit better of a meta choice right now, with water decks being so common. That being said, we're going to talk next about Palkia and Vaporeon, the new, I guess, really top tier archetype alongside the Darkrai decks. Palkia and Vaporeon with the Manaphy Oceanic Gift ability is absolutely insane. It's one of the most consistently explosive decks in the entire game. Consistently, we can use that 150 damage attack on Palkia back to back by turn 3 or turn 4. It's actually a lot faster paced than you would think. Again, Palkia also useful in the early game with that single energy attack. The only downside here is that honestly, like, there are aggro decks that can kind of KO Manaphy pretty early on. If you're going first, it can feel kind of bad that Manaphy oftentimes is just going to get KO'd. It only has 50 HP, so that can be a pretty significant downside to the deck. On top of that, like, you are pretty susceptible to getting revenge KO'd. If you don't have a giant cape, you're at 150 HP, and Magnezone plus a Darkrai ping is enough to KO Palkia, so it is a little bit susceptible to getting revenge KO'd, but with Cyrus, we can attack back-to-back 150 damage attacks with Palkia, which should be enough, honestly, to win games, unless you're playing something like a Gyarados or an Exeggutor. In that fact, we're not taking one-hit KOs. But honestly, the fact that there was so much electric Magnezone decks in this first week of competition, and yet still this Palkia, Vaporeon, and Manaphy deck managed to go 52% average win rate while also getting many placements here in Top Cut, I actually do believe that this is an S tier deck, even though the meta right now isn't particularly super kind to Palkia in tempo water decks in general. I still think that it's so strong. It deserves to be in the S tier. I really can't put it anywhere else. Not only that, but we're also putting Gyarados in the S tier. Nothing's really changed with Gyarados, which is funny. Water decks are just so strong in general with Manaphy. Palkia and Gyarados are such strong attackers, but we have Vaporeon, we have Misty, we have Manaphy. We have so much water type support that no matter what, these cards are going to be really good. Most people are still playing Gyarados with Druddigon and Greninja, yet another great water type card. And like I said, Gyarados hasn't changed a lot, but it doesn't matter because it's inherently still one of the strongest cards in the entire game. So for that reason, I have to put Gyarados in the S tier. It did also win the Ursa Days tournament this weekend and also getting, I think, 3rd or 2nd place. So we got to keep that in mind. It really dominated the top tables in the Top Cut bracket at the Ursa Days 1800 player tournament. And I think a big reason for that is because it's still, like I said, the strongest card or one of the strongest decks in the entire game. Similarly to Charizard, and there are specific counters to these cards. Like the downside to Gyarados is that Magikarp is very easily KO'd. However, if not a lot of people are playing Hitmonlee or playing Zebstrika, then Gyarados doesn't really have anything to worry about, and it's just going to remain as literally one of the strongest decks in the entire game. So for right now, in terms of this meta tier list, yes, it got 1st place, but I'm putting Gyarados in the S tier anyway, just because it was S tier even last format with people hard countering it. The entire format, it did matter. It was still winning, still dominating. We're probably going to see that in this format as well, especially if people don't really adapt to playing more Pikachu or Zebstrika or Hitmonlee, especially if they don't, because Gyarados is just going to dominate no matter what. Honestly, it's going to come down to whether people hard counter it or not, whether they choose not to. It might end up like Mewtwo, where last format people didn't really play hard counters to Mewtwo. It just ended up kind of always doing well at every tournament last format. So we'll have to see how people really handle Gyarados, but trust me, it will continue to dominate and it will continue to win back to back and just all the time because it's such a strong deck. And like I said, Gyarados doesn't really care about Magnezone. Like, it's got does 110 damage. Yes, that's 130 against Gyarados, but we have 180 HP. It really doesn't, we're just KOing whatever's in our path, honestly. We can also technically go up to 200 HP with Giant Cape, so we got to keep that in mind. Gyarados remaining S tier. Palkia, new inclusion to S tier, but definitely still belongs in S tier in my opinion, even in this heavy Magnezone format. Next up is going to be Aerodactyl with Lucario. So there were 2 fighting decks that actually got like top 8 placements at either of the big tournaments this weekend. One of them was a Rampardos and Lucario deck, and the other one was actually Aerodactyl and Lucario. So first, let's talk about Aerodactyl and Lucario. I think Lucario is exceptionally good. In fact, I think fighting decks in general are exceptionally good right now. If you look at the metagame and the meta share of this first week of competition, people did not choose to play fighting, and I think there's a variety of reasons for that. They're not actually hitting for super effective against the dark type decks, which are exceedingly popular. So for that reason, people just maybe were like, well, are we really going to play fighting? We also didn't get a lot of new fighting cards. We got Gallade, which is a pretty mid card overall. Then we did get Lucario, which Lucario is actually, it fits really well into all of the old fighting archetypes that we had of last format. So it makes sense to me that Aerodactyl and Lucario actually go together really well. And these Aerodactyl aggro fighting decks are just really good in general. Lucario is just a good card. It gives Aerodactyl the potential to do 100 or even 120 damage as a stage 1 Pokemon for only 2 energies, which is exceptionally strong. It also goes really well with Primeape, as we see here, which did do fairly well at this tournament. and just a variety of different decks. Rampardos is the other one. So this fighting deck did get top 8, and like I said, I think fighting wasn't very well represented in this format right now. It is really nice to potentially be able to one-hit KO Magnezone, even though it probably has Giant Cape a lot of the time, but either way, just very, very consistent, fast-paced, aggressive fighting type decks. There's also not a lot of Psychic in the format. There is a decent amount of Grass, which can be a little bit tough for Aerodactyl and other fighting type cards that are weak to Grass, but not a lot of Psychic anymore. In general, I think that aggro fighting decks are even better now with Lucario, so they should see more play, in my opinion, as time goes on. And next is going to be the Rampardos deck, which I think also got top 8 or top 4, I think, at the Ursa Days tournament. And this is interesting to me. I don't know if we have another Golem situation where this is sort of one of those one-of fighting decks that does really well in the early metagame, on the early weeks of competition, and then maybe something else just fills its spot because people realize that there's other ways to play fighting decks that are better. I don't know. I think Rampardos is a pretty strong card. 130 damage is significant, boosted with Lucario. Again, that gets high enough to KO almost anything in the format, really, and it is very, very strong. Again, we are playing plenty of different Pokemon in the deck because Rampardos plus Lucario fills up a lot of spaces in our deck anyway. It's more of a late game strategy. It really just depends on how the meta formulates. I do think that Rampardos is a good card no matter what. Just like Aerodactyl, they're both really strong. The fossil Pokemon in this format right now are actually all really good, whether it's Aerodactyl EX or the new Rampardos and Bastiodon, as we see here. But I don't know. I think I'm going to just comfortably kind of put it in the A tier. I wouldn't really put too much stock in Rampardos specifically. Like I said, I think all of these fighting decks are kind of just, you know, aggressive and potentially decent in the mid to late game if you're playing Aerodactyl and Rampardos. But overall, it's just the fighting archetypes that have been good for so long. I think that they actually deserve to see more play because Gyarados is running around pretty often, so we probably want to run those Hitmonlee Marshadow packages. Marshadow as well, heavily boosted by Lucario, makes that card that much better, as well as Primeape, which actually did fairly decent in this tournament as well. I don't know. I'm honestly just going to put all of these in the A tier because they aren't like exceptionally powerful. They're probably going to find their way into like the low to mid A tier. But Primeape is another example of a card that just does a lot of extra damage. It gets buffed very heavily by something like a Lucario. It's a stage 1 Pokemon, 1 energy, and its attack cost. Technically speaking, on our second turn going first, we can hit for 90 damage for 1 energy with Primeape, which is crazy. It really is. We have low amount of HP, which is definitely a downside to this deck. It is a little susceptible to some early attacks from maybe like Weavile and Darkrai. You can get 1-hit KO'd by that combo, so we got to keep that in mind as well. But overall, I do think that Primeape is a good partner for Lucario, and a lot of these Lucario-based fighting decks do have a proper spot in the format. We just have to see. We have to wait and see kind of what people decide to be the best way to play these fighting decks as time goes on. We just don't really know. Last format, we had like 5 or 6 different fighting archetypes that were all different, but all saw considerable play. They never won any tournaments of last format, but they all were kind of floating at that like high B, low A tier range, which I think is probably where fighting type decks really deserve to be right now. However, again, heavy Magnezone format, heavy Darkrai format, there could be a pretty significant place for these fighting type decks. Next up, let's skip to like this Magnezone fighting deck, which actually again did really well in one of these recent online tournaments. I believe it got a top 32 finish, maybe top 16, I don't quite remember. But this is really cool. So this is like a Marshadow, Hitmonlee, Hitmonchan, you know, base deck, but instead of playing like Lucario, Aerodactyl, other things like that, we're just playing the Magnezone package. So it's really interesting. Again, it's a kind of a tech inclusion. That's one of the ways that, again, Magnezone really shines. We don't actually see Magnezone featured in a lot of pure electric type decks. The great part about Magnezone is you can throw it in so many other archetypes. If there's any other strong cards that don't require a lot of different Pokemon or a lot of like, you know, kind of focus when you're building your deck around it, then you can just throw Magnezone in, and then it can just be a really great tech inclusion, especially in a format right now that is heavily dominated by water Pokemon, which in my mind probably will change. I don't expect Palkia Vaporeon to be the most played deck next format. It will probably end up just being Darkrai and Magnezone, which will rank next. We'll rank all the Darkrai decks next, in fact. So that's what I would expect, or next week rather, these Darkrai Magnezone decks to be the #1 most played deck. But Magnezone in general is just really good in a lot of different scenarios, as we see here, whether it's sort of the aggressive fighting package or the aggressive Skarmory package. It fits really well in those low energy, fast-paced, archetypes or packages, right? So I do like this deck. In fact, I don't know. Like, again, these are all really solid decks. Fighting in general is just really solid. I don't really want to put them in the B tier. If I was going to put a fighting deck in B tier, maybe it would be Primeape. Maybe we put Primeape high B tier. Maybe I'll do that because I put this Skarmory deck in the high B tier. I don't want our A tier to be like just absolutely filled to the brim. So we'll put Primeape in the B tier. It saw less play than the other ones and less success, so maybe that's fair. We'll put it in the B tier here, but in general, I think that the Lucario fighting decks are all really good. And Magnezone actually, again, like I said, pairs really well with that Marshadow, Hitmonchan, Hitmonlee package. So I really like that. Okay, so next up, let's take a look at all of the Darkrai decks. There are 4 of them here that we're going to rank. Let's rank them by the order of how popular they were in this first week. So again, by far the most popular deck and also the most successful deck of this format was, or this tournament, I keep saying format, of this week's, tournaments of this new format was Darkrai and Magnezone. This deck is honestly perfect, not only as a meta call right now, but in the overall construction of the deck, right? So Darkrai, we can kind of set it up on our bench. It does chip damage as we attach to it. We can leave a Druddigon in the active spot, force our opponent to attack the Druddigon, doing even more chip damage, while all the while allowing our Magnezone to set itself up and be really useful in a lot of different matchups, specifically, again, against those water-type decks. So the flow of this deck is really, really good. I think that Druddigon and Darkrai pair really well, and then Magnezone and Darkrai pair really well also, again, right, because we don't have to. We can run only Dark Energies and just attach those energies to Darkrai and allow Magnezone to set itself up. I think that's a really big upside of the deck. Just a great meta call, but Darkrai in general, one of the strongest new cards that we have in this format. And again, it was actually the most popular deck, I think, across both of the tournaments, and ended up winning the Spraggles Who Glandia tournament, and it got like most of the top 16 finishes in the Ursa Days tournament. So something will have to happen. I think that people will probably either play this deck or play a counterplay to this deck. So we'll have to see how the meta evolves. I'm actually really excited to see how things kind of change week to week and how people deal with some of these top tier contenders. But right now, this does certainly appear to be the best way to play Darkrai EX. At least in the current meta, again, a lot of water-type Pokemon. We're going to see less water next week, in my opinion, which means that this particular way to play Darkrai might be maybe a little bit less impactful, but overall, it's good against all of the other matchups, so I don't think there's really a reason to not play Magnezone with Darkrai. The other way to play it's going to go in the S tier. It has to go in the S tier, especially after this first week of competition. Next up is going to be Darkrai with Weavile, which I am actually going to put in the A tier. So the reason Weavile and Darkrai is going into the A tier is because there's still a lot of grass-type decks in the format. We see here Exeggutor and Yanmega. We see Exeggutor and Celebi. We even saw Dialga and Yanmega pretty prominently played in this week's competition. The problem with Darkrai EX and Weavile is it's much more easily countered by those grass-type decks, which we do actually have a fair bit of them in the format. So for that reason, it's not as well positioned in the meta. Also, people haven't really decided or figured out the best way to play Darkrai and Weavile. There's a few different ways that I've seen. I've actually seen people not playing any other Pokemon, just playing Darkrai and Weavile. I saw a version of that deck, exclusively Darkrai Weavile, actually do really well in one of these tournaments, but the other common ways that people play this deck is either with Spiritomb and Cyrus as sort of a combination to potentially allow us to gust up our opponent's Pokemon in the mid to late game a little bit more consistently. That's a good strategy. The other strategy is more of a combo-based deck where we're playing Farfetch'd and Dawn, so the combination of Farfetch'd and Weavile with Dawn allows us to have really strong combinations both on our first turn going second and our second turn going first. So that's really, really good. In my mind, I do like the Farfetch'd combo version of Weavile and Darkrai, but again, like I said, it's the first week and people don't necessarily know the best way to play this list, so it also didn't perform as well nearly as the other Darkrai decks that we'll take a look at here in a second. So I'm going to put it in the A tier. I think it's a really strong, aggressive Dark-type deck, but again, very heavily countered by Exeggutor and Grass-type decks, so not as well positioned nearly as the Magnezone deck with Druddigon, but still very strong in its own right, very explosive. So we're going to go ahead. We're definitely going to put it in the A tier here. I'm moving quick, so I apologize, but I don't want this video to be 3 hours long. Next up is going to be Weezing with Darkrai. This one's interesting because the thing about Weezing and Darkrai is it's actually probably the best Darkrai deck in sort of the mirror match, right? Because Weezing can take those that 20 damage sort of chip damage that Darkrai is doing in the mirror matchup, and you can actually just full heal your Weezing by playing Koga and scooping it back up into your hand. So against other Darkrai decks, Weezing might actually be like the best anti-mirror match pick. But it's not as good against, I think, all of the other matchups in the format. Psychic isn't very heavily played, so it doesn't really matter. Like, Weezing is fairly good, but it's a little bit underwhelming compared to things, again, like Magnezone, like Druddigon paired with Darkrai, and even Weavile. So I think for that reason, we're probably going to put this version of Darkrai in the B tier. I just don't expect people to choose to play Weezing Darkrai over really Weavile or Magnezone, or the next version of Darkrai, which we're going to take a look at here, which is actually with Greninja. So this was actually the least commonly played version of Darkrai, but we're playing it very similarly to how we play Gyarados, where we're playing Darkrai with Druddigon and Greninja. The other upside to this deck is that it's so much chip damage, it's so flexible. Pokemon Communications makes Greninja that much better, but also Cyrus. So Greninja and Cyrus go very well together. We can, again, Water Shuriken a Pokemon on our opponent's bench, and then target it to bring it up into the active spot and KO it with, again, probably our Darkrai. So there's a lot of good synergy there. Again, we can just always commit those Dark Energies to Darkrai every single turn to keep up that chip damage, and it's just really, really good. So I actually am super high on this Greninja version of Darkrai. Again, it was very not as much played as the Magnezone version, but if we're not talking about sort of a counter meta electric type version of Darkrai, I do actually think that this is overall maybe the best way to play Darkrai EX. So it's really, really, really strong. It's super flexible. I actually, in fact, kind of like it better than Weavile right now into the format because, again, we're pairing the, the Darkrai Druddigon combo, which is, again, really proven to be really good in this new format, but we also have that classic Greninja Druddigon combination, which has always been really, really good since we initially saw play a lot in the last format, and now we have Cyrus to make the deck that much more aggressive in the mid to late game, and we have Pokemon Communications to get into the Greninja even more consistently. So that's how I feel about this deck. I am going to put it in the S tier. I think it should see more play. It probably won't because people are just going to play Magnezone, but honestly, I think that the Greninja Druddigon Darkrai deck is absolutely just ridiculous. It's so good. So much extra damage. Potentially doing 120? 120 damage on one turn if you Water Shuriken attach to Darkrai and attack. That's really good, even in the mid to late game. So I really, really like it. One of my favorite ways to play Darkrai right now. And that's the Darkrai decks. Weavile or Darkrai and Weezing probably could go into A tier, but we gotta leave some spots for the B tier. So you know what? It's gonna go into the B tier. You should play the other versions of Darkrai more so, in my opinion. That's just my opinion. Okay, so next up, let's talk about Celebi. Just straight up Jungle Totem Celebi with Exeggutor. So here's the thing. Celebi is Celebi. Grass is actually better now than it ever was before. The grass typing hitting Darkrai for weakness can be really, really strong. In fact, I think Exeggutor is actually just one of the best decks in the entire format. It's strong in the early game. It's got a lot of HP. You can attach Giant Cape to it. That's 180 HP. We have Erika's that's going to counter the pings that Darkrai does. Again, very fast-paced, aggressive damage, a lot of HP. It's just so good. Also more consistent now with Pokemon Communications, allowing us to find Exeggutor EX earlier and more consistently than we were able to last format. So I feel very comfortable putting Celebi in the S tier. These aren't in order, by the way. I feel very comfortable putting Celebi in the S tier, or not S tier, the A tier right now. If it sees more play, I honestly think it could dominate. Similarly to how it did last format, Celebi was actually one of the only decks last format that won 2 Ursa Days tournaments. I think it might have been the only deck of last format that won 2 Ursa Days tournaments. It's just really good. Dark's weak to grass. Grass is even better in this new format. Like I said, we have Pokemon Communications, we have the new tool cards, all things that make Exeggutor better. Pokecom also, again, allows us to find Jungle Totem Superior even more consistently. So it's just a really, really good deck. It didn't see as much play this week as maybe you would think. Again, the metagame and the meta share is a little bit skewed. People were kind of choosing to play a lot of the new cards, which, again, makes sense. But I think as things kind of really settle down and fall into place, we're going to see grass-type decks and Celebi decks just honestly still being potentially S-tier decks as we've seen in previous formats. But for right now, let's just say maybe high A tier for Celebi and Exeggutor. It didn't place extraordinarily high in any of the tournaments, but I think it definitely has potential. And next up is Exeggutor and Mew EX. This is an archetype that really didn't see a lot of play in this first week. Again, this deck doesn't really incorporate any new cards. You could plug in Shaman. In fact, I actually really like an Exeggutor deck with Shaman and Mew EX. Mew EX, the stock for Mew EX is a lot higher now. Unfortunately, not a lot of people played Mew EX in this first week of combination. It just doesn't really fit into a lot of these newer archetypes that we see here, like Darkrai, like these water package decks, or even grass decks. So it's kind of tough that, there's not a lot of Mewtwo anymore because it's not greatly positioned in the format, which we'll talk about shortly, but Mew EX is really good. We actually saw Charizard kind of dominate and get 2 spots in top 5 as well of the Ursa Days tournament. A big reason for that, Charizard got buffed pretty heavily. We'll talk about that next, but Mew EX just didn't see a lot of play, and it does counter a lot of Pokemon in this format exceptionally well. Palkia being one of them. Gyarados, it does pretty well with Gyarados. That's 140 damage, but also, again, just really, really good card against Charizard, which was a top 3 played deck this week and will likely remain one of the strongest decks of this format, which we'll talk about next. So I actually really like it. We haven't seen a refined deck list here, but if I had to build an Exeggutor deck right now, I would play just straight Exeggutor with Mew EX. If we're not playing Yanmega, that is, I would just play Exeggutor, Mew EX, and then maybe 1 copy of Shaman to further help us in that Darkrai matchup. But I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to put it in the A tier. I think Exeggutor, literally one of the best cards in the entire format right now, so I feel very confidently putting Exeggutor this high up on the tier list. We're not in order, so let's just put it up here. But yeah, I really do like Exeggutor decks right now. And Mew EX, the stock's high. People need to play Mew EX more, in my opinion. If they don't, you're going to have to face the wrath of an improved Charizard archetype, which coincidentally has gotten a lot better, which is kind of scary considering, like I said, not many people are teching in Mew EX to counter for Charizard, which hopefully we see more in the upcoming weeks. But the thing with Charizard is that it's always had the highest upside out of anything in the format. It's a little bit less consistent and slow to build up. It always has been, but we're able to basically one-hit KO anything in the format. Giant Cape does put some Pokemon out of range of Charizard, which is a little bit of an issue in its own right, but that being said, Charizard is just exceptionally strong, much more consistent now in a variety of different ways. So the way that people were playing Charizard this week that did best was not with, Mew EX, it wasn't with, Arcanine, it was literally just straight Charizard and Moltres. And when you build a deck like that, it makes your deck so much more consistent with Pokemon communications, because I've said this a number of times in my videos, but Pokemon communications might be the most influential card from Space-Time Smackdown. If you're building your decks a certain type of way where you're maybe running minimal amounts of basic and evolution Pokemon, basically the way that your deck flows is that you're guaranteed to start with a basic Pokemon, so that's -1 basic Pokemon from your deck. We are also running Pokeballs, so you can just basically pull or draw basic Pokemon out of your deck a lot more quickly than you might think, and then leaving really only evolution Pokemon in your deck, which is almost a guarantee to pull that out of your deck. I hit my mic, sorry, with Pokemon communication. So Charizard much more consistent now. We also have the new Dawn card, which we see play in Darkrai as a combination card, but it also makes being able to attack more consistently with these Charizard Moltres decks even more consistent, basically, being able to move an energy up to the active spot. So I really like Dawn, and as well as Pokemon communications in Charizard. And like I said, it just does really well in this format right now. It did really well at the Ursa Days tournament. I think it's going to continue to do well. I think it's by far one of the strongest decks in the game. And unfortunately, for a lot of other people that aren't playing Charizard, it's more consistent now, and less people seem to be playing Mew EX. So the format really wide open for Charizard. I would expect it to really do well in the upcoming weeks, unless, again, something really changes and Mew EX becomes, predominantly more powerful or more common. So we'll have to see. So the other way to play Palkia here is with Starmie. So I do think that the way that we're seeing here with Palkia, I have 3 different Palkia decks on this tier list. Let's get those knocked out right now. This version here is Palkia with Vaporeon and Manaphy, which again is, in my mind, definitely the best way to play Palkia. But if we wanted to just include Palkia in decks and not necessarily build the deck exclusively around Palkia EX, we could just play Starmie EX, which is still a really consistent, tempo attacking option. I think with all the Magnezone running around, and with I think the uptick in Pikachu decks that we're probably going to see in the upcoming weeks, I don't think that this is a great way to play Palkia. It did actually do fairly consistently well, because I do think it does well against a lot of other cards in the format, but or a lot of other decks. But in general, I'm not as high on this version of Palkia as I am the one with Manaphy and Vaporeon, just the absolute, explosive Palkia deck. This one, it's much more like, hey, in certain decks, like I can actually go into Palkia to end the game, and I will, and we're going to win that way. But a lot of decks don't really allow you to do that. There's a lot of Pokemon in the format that can one-hit KO Starmie. Even though we do have really great pace, Pokemon communications does make Starmie more consistent. We still have Misties. It's still a really good tempo water deck, but I just don't really think that a deck like this is super well positioned in the meta with so much Magnezone running around. So I'm going to go ahead and put it in the high B tier for now. In my mind, I would definitely play this version of Palkia because it's just so explosive. The other way that people are playing Palkia here is with Greninja. And this is basically the same deck as Gyarados, but instead of Gyarados, we have Palkia. I don't love this version either. Technically, it's not that bad. Again, the Druddigon Greninja combination is always good, but unfortunately, without Oceanic Gift, we're kind of not always consistently able to attack multiple times in a row with Palkia, which makes it just maybe a little bit less consistent overall. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm actually going to put the Starmie deck in the A tier because it is very consistent, even though it maybe doesn't have the best matchup spread right now. But this version of Palkia with just Greninja and Druddigon, I'm going to go ahead and put it in the B tier. This is not, I don't think, the way we should be playing Palkia. There's a reason why we play Gyarados that way, is because we have 180 HP and we can attack turn after turn very consistently. Palkia, we can't really do that, so we need to really bank on the Oceanic Gift attack from Manaphy to really just stack a bunch of energies on Palkia so we can attack turn after turn. Much more kind of front-loaded in this particular deck here. This one, just maybe, I don't know. I mean, I don't think it's bad, but again, if we're playing Druddigon, Greninja, and Palkia, we should probably just play Gyarados. And that's my personal opinion. So this version of Palkia going in the S tier, this version of Palkia with Starmie going in the A tier, but the Greninja Dredagon version I would just put in the B tier. I don't think it's as high as the other two. Again, that's just my opinion. So next up we have Pikachu and Pikachu and Pachirisu. So Pikachu and Zebstrika saw a little bit of play this week at the Ursa Days tournament. It kind of struggled. I think people are really kind of figuring out the best way to play Pikachu right now. However, we did see multiple instances of Pachirisu decks actually making it in to Top Cut and doing fairly well in Top Cut as well. So I think that Pachirisu and Pikachu pair together really, really well. There was that 18 trainer card Pachirisu deck, which is a little bit of a meme, but also not really a bad deck in its own right either. I think just sort of aggressive or tempo electric type decks are actually pretty good in the format right now. I think a lot of people kind of just choosing to play Darkrai over those decks, but the thing is, again, like I said, we're probably going to have to play Zebstrika to counter these Gyarados EXs that are running rampant in the format. So I don't know, maybe we just merge like this Pikachu and Pachirisu deck with a Pikachu and Zebstrika deck. Unfortunately though, at the same time, like Zapdos has gotten a lot better because we do have Dawn, so we can get Zapdos set up a little bit more consistently and it can one-hit KO things, so I don't know. We'll have to see kind of people how you know, things kind of change, or you know, how the meta formulates. I do think that Pikachu is still an A tier deck. It's so consistent, it's just great damage, 80 or 90 damage on your second turn, and really every turn from there on out is really, really, really good. And again, a lot of water type decks in the format, so I think it's just really good. I'm also going to put Pikachu Zebstrika in the A tier, but I'm going to put it at the bottom of A tier. Because overall, Pachirisu and Pikachu is just better, but Zebstrika, again, might be needed for Gyarados. Pikachu and Zebstrika, like I said, it struggled this week from a win rate perspective, but I think that's because maybe we haven't maximized the potential of Pikachu decks, at least at the moment, but they do both deserve to see more play. Maybe I'll just put them both. I'll put them both here at the bottom of A tier. I don't want to put them in the B tier. I really don't, because like I said, Electric is just one of the best types in the entire game right now. Pikachu and Pachirisu, both extremely consistent tempo cards, as they always have been, and I think there's definitely room for them in this format, so they're going to go into the A tier, both, in my opinion. The A tier is going to be pretty widely built out, but that's oftentimes how it is, I think, in my opinion. And next up, we have Exeggutor and Yanmega. So another really interesting grass type deck. Unfortunately for Yanmega, it didn't end up being very useful against the Magnezone decks. It's really a guard that counters Darkrai and Weavile specifically. It doesn't really counter Magnezone much at all, and that's a little bit unfortunate. So in a lot of matchups, at least in this first week of competition, this deck really relied on Exeggutor. Still a good deck, still a really consistent tempo grass type deck, but like I said, a lot of Gyarados, a lot of Charizard, a lot of Darkrai Magnezone running around. And we don't necessarily do too much other than just really consistent grass type damage, which can be good, again, in specific matchups, but I don't know if it's really up there to contend with the S tier deck. So Yanmega is really good. I think it's a really important card to have in the format right now, but unfortunately for Yanmega, most people ended up playing Darkrai with Magnezone and not Weavile, and we're probably going to see that even more so as the weeks go on. Not that Weavile is bad, it's just that, you know, again, if you're playing a deck that's entirely countered by one Pokemon, you're probably just not going to choose to play that deck, which again is going to further decrease the stock of that Pokemon that counters that deck, right? So I think if we're playing Exeggutor, like I said, I would maybe rather play it with Mew EX and Shaman, because Exeggutor can kind of carry a lot of times anyway. So Yanmega is very, very useful in particular matchups, again, like I said, against Darkrai Weavile, but overall, I mean, it had a decent win rate. It didn't really do anything super spectacular this tournament, but I don't think it's a B tier deck. I feel pretty comfortable putting it in the A tier. Okay, so next up, we're going to break some people's hearts here, and it is Dialga with Melmetal. So I said this basically like on repeat before the expansion came out and before this new format came out, that Dialga was a decent card, but its viability really relied on the Pokemon that we were able to pair with it. For that reason, I don't think that Melmetal was ever a top tier card, and Dialga certainly hasn't made it top tier. Yes, it allows you to go into Melmetal a little bit more consistently now, and you do have a very tanky, engine that you can sit in the front end, but Dialga in itself is kind of slow, so if we're playing Dialga decks, we really need high payoff. And the way that we have high payoff with Dialga right now, because our options are all very limited, is going to be playing an anti-meta Dialga pick like with Yanmega. So in specific matchups, we do have high upside being able to set up Yanmega. Or again, if we're playing Mew EX with Dialga, that's going to have tremendous upside, right, in some matchups. So we got to keep that in mind. But for just purely Melmetal and Dialga, again, we're not hitting anything for weakness. We're getting one hit KO'd by a lot of these strong decks in the format right now. We're slower paced. We don't have incredible damage. Yes, we have some survivability, but that doesn't really matter in a lot of different decks that have just better pace. So unfortunately, I am going to put Melmetal and Dialga in the C tier. I just don't think this deck really deserves to see play. That's just my opinion. Whereas Dialga and Yanmega with Mew EX is what I would consider this anti-meta Dialga deck. I actually really do think that this deck should go into the A tier. That's my opinion. It's a really, really strong anti-meta pick. Again, Dialga isn't a bad card, but we need some high payoff in the targets that we're accelerating energies to. Yanmega in some matchups is certainly that option, and same as Mew EX if we're going up against, you know, Charizard or I don't even know, what other Pokemon, I guess even Gyarados or Palkia, right? The upside for Mew EX is tremendously high once we get it set up. So I like the anti-meta Dialga deck. It actually did very well this week. It had, I think, a couple of top 32 placements, top cut placements. It didn't really, you know, explode in success this week, but I do think that it's a pretty solid archetype. So I'm going to put it in the A tier. It really is kind of the only Dialga archetype, at least at the moment, that's kind of worth playing. So unfortunately to Melmetal, it's going to go into the C tier. Like I said, Melmetal, it literally just didn't do anything this week. And that's a little bit unfortunate, and I don't think it really will for future weeks to come. So next up we have Articuno, and Articuno is interesting. This is more of, again, sort of a tempo water deck that does play, you know, Manaphy or Vaporeon or Palkia. It did get buffed pretty considerably. I don't think it's as good as the cards in decks in A tier, but like I said, with Manaphy, with Cyrus as well, Cyrus does make Articuno a little bit better. But like I said, so much Magnezone flying around. Pikachu decks are going to see play. Pachirisu decks are going to see play. And because of that, it's hard to play water decks that aren't either super explosive like this Palkia deck up here or really tanky like this Gyarados deck. So for that reason, I'm kind of going to put it just in the B tier. I think it's still good. I think that he can still pop off with turn 1 Blizzard. Cyrus makes this deck a little bit better now, makes Articuno a little bit better now, but overall, I don't feel like super strong about Articuno decks still. I think that this heavy Magnezone format isn't very kind to them, and they don't have super high damage upside anyway. Really, the big upside to this deck is Palkia, and if we're going to be playing Palkia, we should just be playing straight Palkia, and that's my 2 cents there. Next up is Charizard and Arcanine, which again, I'm also actually going to put this deck in the B tier this week. So the thing with Charizard is that Arcanine isn't necessarily providing a lot of value in the format right now. A lot of things with Giant Cape are just out of range of getting KO'd by Arcanine, and unfortunately, you're just susceptible to getting revenge KO'd by a lot of Pokemon in the format right now. Doing damage to yourself isn't that good. A lot of Pokemon are doing chip damage to you, whether that's Dredagon or Darkrai or Greninja decks, so we got to keep that in mind. Also, you know, the Charizard deck that was in S tier this week is much more consistent in its strategy. Like I said, if we're playing Charizard right now, we're just kind of going all in on the strategy. We're playing Dawn, we're playing Pokemon Communications, we're playing less Pokemon in the deck so that we're more consistently able to go into Charizard, and that's why I believe that the Arcanine version just wasn't very successful this week. It didn't really do anything other than, I think, get about 40 or 45% of its wins, and that is pretty tough overall, but I don't know. Last format, it made sense because Arcanine was in general just a better card, but at the same time, now with Pokemon Communications, we're just changing the way that we build Charizard a lot, really. I mean, it's just a lot different now. So that's why we're going to put this Charizard deck in the B tier. I don't expect Arcanine and Charizard to see much play as time goes on. I think we're going to move towards this new version of Charizard, just straight Charizard and Moltres. We'll have to see. Again, I don't know, just the way it performed this week makes me not want to put it in the A tier, so we're just going to kind of put it in the B tier for sure. Next up, we have Blaine's. No one really played Blaine's this week. Blaine's might be cooked. It might just be over. We might not have anybody playing Blaine's anymore, and that is a little bit unfortunate. So for that reason, we're just going to keep it here and not ranked. Next up, let's take a look at Infernape EX. So Infernape EX is really, really interesting. I might also put it in the B tier. I know some people might be disrespected by that, but here's the thing. Like, when I look at Infernape, I think that's a really good deck. It's consistent. But again, like, is it better really than any of these decks in A tier? It really depends. So I think from a meta call, like, in terms of the quality of the deck, I think it's probably a low to mid A tier deck. I think it's really, really strong and consistent. I think Infernape with Dawn, that combo can be really, really strong. But the thing is, like, is Fire type really that good in the format right now? I don't know. Like, I just don't know if many decks are going to be playing Grass or Metal. I guess if Dialga or these Grass type decks becomes exceedingly popular, hitting for weakness doing 140 can be a really big deal. So I guess I'm going to put it in the A tier because I do actually expect Grass decks to see more play as the weeks go on. I don't think it's nearly as good as Charizard because effectively you're kind of doing the same thing. It's just not nearly as good as Charizard in terms of its upside, but it is really consistent. So, but I don't know. I also don't think we have Infernape fully figured out. It's kind of missing like 1 or 2 cards, I feel like, or maybe like something just hasn't been figured out yet. Maybe we play like Rapidash and Blaine's, instead of Moltres with Infernape. Maybe we do that. I don't know. We'll have to see. I'm kind of I'm a little bit suspect on Infernape because I do think it's a good deck. I think it's a good card, but maybe we're just not really reaching the full potential with it yet. And like I said, if we're playing Moltres decks, we should probably just play Charizard. The upside is a bit higher, and it just has a little bit of a better spot in the format right now. But if Grass becomes even more played, which I do think it's probably going to increase in play in the upcoming weeks, I think that Infernape is actually going to be a pretty decent deck. So let's put it in the A tier. Preemptively put it in the A tier, but I think at the moment it's probably more of a high B tier deck. But, you know, it is what it is. We'll have to see. What else can we rank here? Let's rank Mewtwo. So, okay. Yeah, I think, let's put Mewtwo in the C tier. Now, here's the thing. I think a lot of people are disrespecting Mewtwo because the thing with Mewtwo is that it hasn't gotten any worse. And the reason I say that is because, like, the format hasn't really been power crept that much. The only reason why we can't really dominate the format with Mewtwo right now is purely just because all of the new great dark type decks. So Mewtwo as a deck, like in a vacuum, isn't any worse. In fact, I still think it's a very, very strong deck. Now we have Mythical Slab and Pokemon Communications. The deck should be extremely consistent. 150 damage is 150 damage. Unfortunately, though, a lot of dark type decks in the format. So the format right now, not in the metagame, is very unkind to Mewtwo, which is why I think it's a really terrible choice. I believe it was a top 5 most played deck of this weekend, but it got about a 40 or under 40% win rate, again, because so much Darkrai was being played. And I don't expect that to change. In fact, I believe Darkrai will probably be the most played deck of this format, unless things like Palkia, Gyarados, or Charizard really take it over. So for that reason, unfortunately, I just can't put Mewtwo that much higher on here. I really can't. It just struggles. It just struggles in the format right now. Not a bad deck. Similar to Dialga and Melmetal, it's just not really well positioned, I don't think, in the current format. So I kind of feel a little bit bad about that. But like I said, there's nothing really else we can do about it. And yeah, that might be the tier list, guys. I don't know. We have all of these other decks, but these are kind of decks from older formats, right? We have the Exeggutor Tauros deck, Pidgeot decks, which again, sometimes people are playing them with Dialga, but like I said, if we're considering Pidgeot and Dialga, this would probably go into the C tier anyway, because Pidgeot's just not as good as really all of these other cards above it, unfortunately, and Dialga certainly hasn't made it that much better in its own right. But things like Starmie, Lumineon, again, hasn't really seen play. Scolipede hasn't seen really any play. Golem hasn't seen any play. Pikachu Raichu basically saw no play this weekend. So all of these decks here in the can't rank yet tier are kind of older decks that really didn't see any play in this first week of this new format, in this first week of competition. So for that reason, I can't really rank them, at least yet. So we're going to keep them unranked. And that's going to be the tier list for this week. And I feel actually really, really good about it. Now let's go ahead, and before we end the video, I'm going to put all of these decks in the correct order, and I'll explain that a little bit. So let's go ahead and do that. I'll be right back. Okay, so here we've done it. We've organized the tier list in a way that I think I kind of agree with. I mean, I hope I agree with it. I just did it, but this is the tier list in order. So I think right now the best deck in the format is Darkrai and Magnezone, unless things change and people just stop playing water decks entirely. It's still just very, very good across the board, but also being kind of an anti-meta pick right now makes it that much better. But if we're not playing this really, really specific strong deck of Darkrai Magnezone, I think that Gyarados and Charizard are kind of the next big things right now. If they're not specifically hard countered right now by either Mew EX or, you know, Hitmonlee or Zebstrika for Gyarados, then they're just going to dominate because they are inherently the two strongest Pokemon in the game, and they are actually a lot more consistent now, which is a little bit scary. So we have to do something about Gyarados or Charizard because they are going to end up just winning probably most tournaments unless we counter them specifically. And then Palkia kind of on the outside of that, not as well positioned in the meta, but in terms of the pure strength of the deck, I do believe it is still an S tier archetype in an S tier deck. And then Darkrai and Greninja, this is my dark horse. This is a deck that I hope that people play more because I do think that is exceptionally strong. This is kind of the spicy take of the tier list, but I do think it belongs in the S tier. And then in the A tier, we have the grass type decks, predominantly Exeggutor decks here in the high A tier, and then we have these Magnezone aggro decks below it, and then we have the other Darkrai Weavile deck, another aggro deck, and Dialga and the Yanmega deck. So this whole aspect to this whole top row of A tier is very closely in line. I think that the difference here is very, very minimal, but in general, I think that all of these decks could possibly win and could be extremely strong. It really depends on how the meta formulates and how, you know, what matchups they kind of hit in the top cut. And then we have the, you know, the fighting representatives here of this format, and then the Pikachu decks, and then of course Infernape and Starmie, all decks that I believe do belong in A tier. They are exceptionally good decks. They could win at tournament at any given point in time, but I just can't really put them above those big guys up in S tier. And then again, we have the B tier, which are all really quality decks, but again, I would just really consider playing all of the things above them before I play like Weezing Darkrai, Skarmory Bastiodon, Primeape, Articuno, or Arcanine. So for that reason, we're going to go ahead and put them in the B tier. And then in the C tier, this is really where it's like, people should stop playing these decks. Like, that's my opinion. Like, you really should choose something else other than, you know, Melmetal, Mewtwo, and Pidgeot right now. These are things I would just try to stay away from. I don't think that they're bad, like I said, but they really are not as good as the other cards and the other decks above them. So that's why they belong in the C tier. They saw enough play for me to realize that they really aren't good choices in the current metagame. So that's why I believe we should kind of move off these decks and play something else here, predominantly something hopefully in the A tier or the S tier. But that's going to be the tier list for this week, guys. So like the video and subscribe. It really means a lot to me. The support on this channel has been phenomenal over the last few weeks, so I really, really do appreciate it, guys. Thank you so much. If you like the video, stay tuned. We have more Pocket videos coming out in the future. Again, the meta and the format is going to be shifting and changing drastically over the next few weeks. So next week, we'll do an updated tier list, and the week after that, we'll probably do an updated tier list as well. Again, keeping up with the meta reports and talking about all of the best new decks and strategies and interactions here. But anyway, guys, peace out. Have a good one. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for so much for watching. Join the Discord as well. Link in the description down below. But anyway, guys, have a good one. Peace out. We'll see you guys next time. Bye.